November 1970, Syd Barrett released his second and final solo album. He had made it in 15 sessions over 5 months, with David Gilmour and Richard Wright producing, Jerry Shirley on drums. The closest thing to a real band he had worked with since leaving Pink Floyd. The album was called Barrett, after the man himself, as if there was nothing left to say about him except his name. It did not chart, it sold almost nothing, and within a few months of its release, Syd Barrett had stopped making music entirely. Not as a decision, not as a statement, but simply as a fact. The way a clock stops when the spring runs out. This is the story of Barrett, the album, the man, and the long silence that followed. In February 1970, 1 month after the Madcap Laughs was released, Syd Barrett returned to Abbey Road Studios to begin recording again. David Gilmour took over as producer alongside Richard Wright, and the approach was completely different from the first album. More structured, more organized, more deliberate. Gilmour wanted a unified rhythm section that played the entire record like a proper band. Jerry Shirley on drums, himself on bass, Wright on keyboards, and Syd on all guitars. A clear division of labor that the Madcap Laughs had entirely lacked. The sessions ran for 15 days between February and July, squeezed in around Pink Floyd's own commitments. They were recording a new album at the same time, and some days Gilmour and Wright had to leave a Barrett session to travel to a concert, and then return the following morning. Despite everything, the sessions went more smoothly than the first album. Syd arrived, he played, he delivered takes with a consistency that had been almost entirely absent the previous year. The songs were different from the Madcap Laughs too, more structured, more precise in their strangeness. Baby Lemonade opened the album with something close to a proper pop song. Gigolo Aunt had the energy of a band actually playing together. Effervescing Elephant, which closed the record, was a children's story set to music. Whimsical and completely Syd. Gilmour later said the goal was to show what Syd could still do when given the right conditions. And on its best tracks, the album succeeds at exactly that. But alongside the cleaner production, something else was visible on the album too. More quietly unsettling here because the music around it was more polished. The lyrics to Dominoes describe something slipping away. The reversed guitar solo on that same song had been deliberately recorded with the tape running backwards. A technical choice, but also a metaphor for a mind that was no longer moving in the expected direction. There were tracks on the album that Gilmour later admitted they had essentially rescued from near silence. Barrett warming up or playing something incomplete, and Gilmour taking that fragment and building it into a finished song around Syd's uncertainty. What became Baby Lemonade began as Gilmour fastening a warm-up run of Barrett's fingers onto the beginning of a recording, capturing spontaneity because intention was no longer reliably available. Gilmour later reflected, perhaps we were trying to show what Syd was really like, but perhaps we were trying to punish him. He said this more than a decade later, still unsure which of those two things had been true. Barrett was released in November 1970. Unlike the Madcap Laughs, which had at least reached number 40 on the UK charts, Barrett failed to chart at all. The music press received it with a kind of exhausted sympathy, acknowledging the genius still visible in the grooves while struggling to explain what they were hearing in any conventional critical language. Syd Barrett did not tour. He did not promote the album. He gave a single radio session for a late-night program in February 1971, playing 3 songs from Barrett and nothing else. And then he stopped appearing in public entirely. In early 1972, he made one final attempt at a band, joining a Cambridge group with a drummer named Twink and a bassist named Jack Monk. They played a handful of shows around Cambridge, small venues, local crowds, who came as much out of curiosity as devotion. The last performance ended the same way the Kensington Olympia performance had ended. Syd Barrett walked off stage mid-show and did not return. The band dissolved immediately. In 1974, he entered a recording studio one final time. Without Gilmore, without Wright, without any of the people who had previously helped him hold sessions together. The recordings from those sessions have never been released. And then Syd Barrett left the music industry, not with a statement, not with a farewell, not with any kind of formal ending. He simply stopped, the way a clock stops when the spring runs out. He went back to Cambridge. He had always gone back to Cambridge when the world became too much, and now the world had become permanently too much. So he stayed. For several years, he lived with his mother, Winifred, in the house where he had grown up, the same house he had returned to after the failed sessions of 1968, the same house he had left for London more than a decade before. He painted. He grew vegetables. He went to the local library. He took long walks alone through the Cambridge streets that had known him before he was famous and did not require anything from him now that he was not. He was spotted occasionally in Cambridge, in a supermarket, on a bicycle at a garden center. And these sightings were always treated by the music press as a kind of miracle, as if a man buying groceries was something extraordinary simply because that man had once written great songs. In 1978, he visited an old friend in London, the photographer who had taken many of the photographs used on his solo album covers. By all accounts, they were perfectly ordinary visits, tea, conversation, 2 people who had known each other a long time sitting in a room together. In 2002, he agreed to autograph 320 copies of a book of those photographs, signing each one not as Syd, but as Barrett, having returned entirely to the name his parents had given him, abandoning the nickname the world had known him by for 20 years. It was his last public acknowledgement of a musical past that he had otherwise folded away completely, as neatly and finally as a letter, placed in an envelope and sealed. If this story moved you, subscribe. There are more of them, and not one of them ordinary.